Dover, Brookline, Cambridge, Natick, North Reading. Excellent. Awesome. Great. Well, this should be a really fun tasting. I'm excited to try these wines. They're very be very interesting to see them all next to each other. This is this is the nice thing about this kind of tasting is you don't get to, usually wouldn't have an opportunity to open all of this set of wines at the same time, just because they're kind of splitting hairs in the differences. But as I think you'll see, there's quite noticeable differences between them. And this is the kind of tasting you would do if you showed up at Michel Gros' doorstep in Vosne-Romanée and did a tasting. It would look like this. Start at the bottom and go up through the village and up to the Premier Cru. So great. I think we're all here. So I'll just get started. I'll start sharing my screen here. And as usual, again, most of you guys have done one of these with me before, but just as a reminder, we'll proceed from 1 through 5 normally, but feel free to go back and forth between them, and feel free to ask questions and interject ideas or tasting notes at any time as they occur to you. Great. All right, I will share my screen and we can get started. Let's see. Okay. Go. All right. Can everyone see the screen? Excellent. Everybody see the 5 wines we're going to be tasting? Okay. So we're going to start in the Haute Côte de Nuits, which is the regional level. That's for wine number 1. Then the middle 3 wines will be village wines. And in village wines, to qualify as a village wine in Burgundy, all of the grapes and all the vines have to be within the limits of a single village. They can come from a couple different plots, and in fact, all 3 of these village level wines are blends of different plots. So you can, on the label, you can essentially put the greatest common multiple, the thing that all the things share. So you couldn't put any one of the plots on the label because they're blend with others, but you can put the name of the town because all of the grapes come from the different towns. So number 2 is Nuits-Saint-Georges, number 3 is Chambon-Musigny, and number 4 is Vosne-Romanée. And then for number 5, for the last wine, we're going to go up a step to Premier Cru. And in Burgundy, just as a refresher, there are 4 levels. Grand Cru is the highest, and then next down is Premier Cru, and then village, and then regional. So we'll be tasting regional, the bottom, village, the next one up, and Premier Cru. We won't be tasting any Grand Cru, and we would be tasting Grand Cru from Gros, except we only get like a couple cases a year, and sometimes even less than 2 cases a year from him for his Grand Cru because he has so little of it. So we're going to be sticking at the Premier Cru level with Gros today. Great. So just to orient you geographically, and if you haven't done so yet, you can pour all your wine into your glasses. Just so they have a little chance to breathe. I opened these all at 9, about 8 or 9 this morning. So they've been breathing a little bit, but they were all pretty full in the tops of the little bottles. So it's best to give them a little air. So if you pour all 5 of the wines now, they'll get some air by the time we get down to them. So just to orient you, Burgundy is this red area right here in the middle. There's a satellite region called Chambly right here, but what we're going to be tasting from is the Côte d'Or, which is the top part of this stretch right through here, which starts at the top of Burgundy is Dijon, the city of Dijon, and at the bottom of the Beaujolais is the city of Lyon. So Burgundy stretches between Dijon and Lyon, just about due north and south, a little bit slanted to the northeast and southwest. And you can see it blown up here, or at least these are the top 3 parts of it. So we're going to be tasting, everything we're going to be tasting today is from a very narrow band right at the top of the Côte d'Or. And in fact, here's a larger blow up of where we're going to be tasting. So with the first wine is going to be an Haute Côte de Nuits. So it's actually in the hills to the west of the Côte de Nuits. The Côte de Nuits is this large slope that runs north-south here. That's where most of the famous wines of Burgundy come from. So wine number 1 is going to be off the slope. And then 2, 3, 4, and 5 are going to be on the slope. So once we get past 1, we can zoom in even further into a very narrow area, which you'll see is not very large at all. And here it is. So here's the narrow area. So wines 2 comes from Nuits-Saint-Georges. 3 is going to be up from Chambon-Musigny up here. 4 is going to be in Vosne-Romanée down here, the village level. And then 5 all comes from this little plot right here called the Clos area. But before we get there, we're going to start with the Haute Côte de Nuits. So that's wine number 1. The other thing that's interesting about these 5 wines is that they all come from 2018. 2018 was a very unusual vintage in Burgundy, in a lot of France, actually, because it was so hot. It's kind of been a trend in Burgundy and really all over the place that that growing seasons have been getting warmer, more sunlight, less rain, and kind of shorter growing seasons because of that. That's really everywhere. And it's been a slow trend over the course of a couple decades now, but noticeable trend. In fact, Michel Gros told us that over the 40 years, he's done 40 vintages as the winemaker at the Domaine Michel Gros. And in that time, he estimated that on average, the harvest date had moved between 2 and 3 weeks earlier in the year. So vines are ripening faster, they're ripening earlier, and it's just a lot warmer. Even amid that context, 2018 was an outlier in terms of how hot and how dry and how warm it was. The growing season, which is usually about 100 days from flowering to fruit to when the harvest happens, was shortened to 80 days. So 20% quicker growing season than normal because of all of the sun and all of the heat and the lack of rain. And then in the amount of sunlight, usually, I wrote this down, there's usually a typical growing season has 1,200 hours of sunlight over those 180 days, or over those 100 days. In just the 80 days of the 2018 growing season, there were 1,550 hours of sunlight, which is 30% more than normal. So 30% more than normal in 20% less time. So we're talking about a very condensed, very unusual growing season in Burgundy, even amid a context of much warmer summers. So that produced wines that were much riper, that had a lot more sugar, natural sugar in the grapes, and wines where the trick with winemakers was to pick the harvest date was really crucial when they decided to harvest. So if you harvest too late, you would get wines that were fully ripe, and that the skins were ripe, but they might have had too much sugar. So they would kind of be too ripe, and you would get wines that were very high in alcohol. Like the sugar would get converted to alcohol. If you harvested too early, when the sugars were about where they normally would be, you risked having the skins not be ripe enough and the phenolic maturity not be ripe enough, and you'd risk having kind of greenness in it. So wherever winemakers could, they tried to delay and slow down and stretch out the growing season, so those two maturities, the phenolic ripeness and the sugar ripeness, kind of in line. And so the best wines from this year are where winemakers achieved that. And I would say in most of these cases, Michel Gros achieved that. You can see the wines are, if you've had his wines before, and some of you had his 2017 Vosne Romanée, which we had open at the depot today. These wines are a little bit atypical for him and a little atypical for Burgundy in general, but you'll get a good sense of the terroir. Really what's going to be particularly interesting about wines 2, 3, and 4 is that they're made exactly the same way, with the same amount of oak, same amount of, same harvest date, same everything, same grape, 100% Pinot Noir for all 5 of these. The only thing we're shifting here is terroir, and actually 2, 3, 4, and 5 are only shifting terroir as well. And I suppose 1 too, but the terroir is quite a bit further. So wine number 1, I'm doing a lot of talking here. You guys can definitely start drinking. I hope you already have. Wine number 1 comes from the hills to the west of the Côte de Nuits. So this is Nuits Saint-Georges at the bottom of the Côte de Nuits. And there's this whole area to the west of the west of the Côte de Nuits called the Haute Côte de Nuits. And haute means high, and that's named purposefully. So this is the higher Côte de Nuits, and it is about 100 meters higher in elevation, and it doesn't have quite the same perfect blend of exposition and soil and drainage and soil content, mineral content that the slope here does, which makes this so famous. But it really does have a number of particularly favored hillsides where things are just about right. The nice thing about the Haute Côte de Nuits also is that because it's 100 meters higher, it's a little cooler. There's more wind, and so particularly in a very warm growing season like 2018, you can stretch out the harvest. You can stretch out the growing season a little more. So typically, Gros harvests the Haute Côte de Nuits 8 to 10 days after he harvests the Côte de Nuits, and so that extra 8 to 10 days really does give you a little bit more leeway towards gaining balance, towards gaining freshness, gives the grapes a little bit longer time. They're not quite as rushed as they are sometimes in the Côte de Nuits. The Haute Côte de Nuits is beautiful. It looks like this. It's a rolling hillsides, and the Côte de Nuits in Burgundy along here is kind of all east or southeast facing. all, kind of slight variations of somewhat north and somewhat more south, but in general, it's mostly east facing. In the Haute-Côte-de-Nuit, you find lots of different places. You can see this is west, south, and east facing here at the same time. It's a lovely area. It's actually, there's quite a bit of farmland in the area that's kind of patchworked between the different plots of vines. Pre-phylloxera, there was a ton of wine made up here. Phylloxera was a root louse that devastated all the vines of Burgundy in the 1880s, I think, 1890s, the end of the 20th century. And a lot of the vines that were here were not replanted because they just decided it wasn't worth the effort to replant all of these new these vines with new rootstocks that were resistant to this root louse in the Côte d'Or, because you get a lot more money for it. They replanted them immediately. It took a lot longer for these wines, for this area, to be replanted with vines. So the wines that were the vines for the wine that we're drinking today, wine number 1, were planted by Michel Gros' father, Jean Gros, and they are about 40 years old. So they were planted in the 70s or 80s. And Jean Gros was an early adopter for the Haute-Côte. You could say he's an early adopter. He's kind of an early re-adopter for the Haute-Côte, because the Haute-Côte-de-Nuit has, they've been making wine there for centuries. But he was among the first producers that really saw the potential of the Haute-Côte-de-Nuit to make wines that had a little bit more, not quite the same depth and age worthiness as the wines in the Côte d'Or, but really, true expressions of Pinot Noir and true Burgundian wine. So he planted a lot of vines up there. And in fact, about half of Michel Gros' acreage for his whole domain is in the Haute-Côte, and half of it is in the Côte-de-Nuit. And that's really more a function of there being a ton of it in the Côte-de-Nuit than there being not much or a ton of it in the Haute-Côte than there being not much in the Côte-de-Nuit. So these are 40-year-old vines. You can see the nose is kind of a classic young Burgundy with a little bit more darkness and deepness than you often find. You can also see here, if you've been on the, I'll show you, you'll see later, the vines are planted differently. They're further apart. I don't quite exactly know how further apart, but much further apart, maybe twice the difference, the space between the vines, or at least 80% more space. They're also grown a lot higher. So you can see this is not an optical illusion. These are higher than Michel Gros. This is at harvest time. And they're grown this way, and they grow, they don't all make them grow in a straight line around the hillside. So if the hillside curves, they curve with the hillside. So they're kind of like trellises or terraces that go, as you go down a hillside. And all of this is because they didn't have the same rules they had in the Côte d'Or, and they're able to give a little bit more airflow. Historically, it's been harder to grow vines up here and get grapes that were clean because it was a little bit more humid, a little bit less warmth than there is in the Côte. So you'd end up with kind of colder, wetter conditions up here. In the last couple of years, that's been less of a problem. But that's why these vines are planted a little wider for increased airflow. Gros makes a couple different wines from up here, and we'll be tasting the Haute-Côte, regular Haute-Côte. He makes 2 cuvées that are different, that are named as well. So you see a nice dark nose, some kind of berry fruit, a little bit of earthiness, a little bit of chalkiness in there too. In the mouth, there's a nice density. There's a nice Burgundian dryness, I'd say. Not really, tannins aren't young harsh tannins, but they're there. They're kind of cool tannins, I would say. There's nice balance to the tannins with the fruit and with the acidity. Lots of ripeness, but there is, it's not lacking acidity. If you have a wine that's made in conditions that are too ripe, they're very kind of flabby and not they just lack a little bit of vibrancy. I would say this has good vibrancy to it. Yeah, not super long, not a ton of acidity, but enough that it's balanced and enough that it's well put together, I would say. Yeah, not a one-dimensional amount of fruit, maybe not as much fruit and spice and other things as you'll get in the next set of wines, but I think a nice introduction to the Gros wines 2018. All right, so I'm going to move to wine number 2 now, so we can compare these. So this is kind of in French, they call the first thing you have on your plate an amuse-bouche, which means to amuse your mouth, kind of set your palate. And so this is a little bit of a set your palate wine, and then the next four we'll be playing with the terroirs. And as you see on this, this is also the oak coat here. It's really a lovely, beautiful, beautiful area, particularly at harvest time, all the leaves start to change. You'll see here we're really playing with a very small variation of terroir, even though you'll see, I think the wines are quite different. So we'll move to wine number 2 now. And actually, if you go back and forth between wine number 1 and wine number 2, you'll see the difference of why, the vines planted here along the Côte d'Or are of a different caliber than the vines planted over here. The terroir producing wines here is less, it is more favored than what's over here, commands a higher price, commands more age worthiness. There's just a different amount of complexity in wine number 2 next to wine number 1. So Nuits Saint-Georges, which is the appellation, is a very interesting appellation. It's at the very southern end of the Côte de Nuits, near the border with the Côte de Beaune, which is the second half of the southern half of the Côte d'Or in Burgundy. Nuits Saint-Georges is an enormous appellation by Burgundy standards, which means it's small, but it's bigger than most of the other Burgundy appellations, particularly based on its size and based on the diversity of its terroir. So you can see here it stretches from the border with Vosne Romanée all the way down here to Prémaux-Prissé. This is the last part of Nuits Saint-Georges here. It's it's about 6 miles from end to end, which doesn't seem like a lot, but in Burgundy, sometimes 100 yards will make all the difference in a wine, which we'll see later. So 6 miles of terroir really does have an enormous amount of spectrum, but from one end to the other. And so usually people will bottle, it's helpful to know where in Nuits Saint-Georges your wine comes from. And in general, there are 3 sectors of Nuits Saint-Georges that people identify. One is the part that's north of the village, right here. Then a part that's just south of the village. And then the third part is down here in this little hamlet of Prémaux-Prissé, which has its own kind of character. The wine we're going to be tasting today is from north of Nuits Saint-Georges, so near the Vosne border. So here we oriented now. This is north off the top right of your screen and left and south off the left of your screen. And so this is Vosne Romanée here in the middle, and Nuits Saint-Georges is the leftmost thing here. And you can see this is the part of Nuits Saint-Georges that's just north of the town. So the town is here off the left side of your screen. And so all of the plots, this is a blend of 4 different plots, and they all come from 4 vineyards north of the town. And those tend to have a little bit of a silkier character than the classic Nuits expression right downtown in the middle of the appellation, which is a little bit richer and fuller and meatier. So this is the Nuits Saint-Georges that is kind of the most elegant side of Nuits Saint-Georges. And you see there's a nice spiciness to it. There's a dark kind of masculinity to it. Nice, lots of dark fruit, lots of kind of woodsy fruit. It's not woodsy in an old wine way, because it does smell like a young wine, but there's kind of a honey, herbal, woodsy stuff going on. A little bit more perfume to this wine than in the oak coat. Yeah, and actually, going back and forth between the 2 of them, dark red Griot. Yeah, I think Griot is good. Is wild cherries. I had set this up mostly as a comparison between the different terroirs on the coat, with the oak coat as an intro. But actually, if you need to be sold on the difference between the oak coat and the Côte d'Or, the difference between 1 and 2, I think, is a good example of that. Particularly in the mouth too. It's much longer than the Côte de Nuits. There's a kind of a rustic tenor to the tannins. They're not the tannins aren't not really rustic feeling per se. They're kind of rustic tasting. I don't know. They have a little bit of a woodsiness, kind of a sauvage quality to them. Yeah, they're very interesting. And I think, again, here, Gros has picked early enough that he's found enough acidity. The wine is in balance, but he's picked late enough that there isn't any greenness in the wine. The white wine has a classic Nuits profile of kind of dark, woodsy, meaty, beefy aromas. Yeah, it's very pretty. Gros also makes another cuvee of Nuit Saint-Georges from the other side of the town, called Les Chalios, which is all from a single vineyard. And that one is more of a classic Nuit expression. It's more of a bold, rich, dark, almost savory, almost kind of, like a Maillard reaction, like beef, like browned beef notes to the wine. This one's a little bit more, it still has a Nuit character, but has a little bit more of a lift to it, a little bit more of a silkiness to it. I'll say that we're now going to move to wine 3, but I encourage you to keep enough wine 2 in your glass that you can try 2 and 4, because that also is a really exciting, I think, interesting terroir comparison, because wine 2 comes from 4 plots all right here, and most of it comes from Olavière and Aubade-Combe, which are right here along the border with Vosne-Romanée, and most of the village Vosne-Romanée comes from Auréat here, which is right on this border here. So literally in adjoining plots between Auréat and Olavière and Aubade-Combe. But you'll see between 2 and 4 exactly, I think, why they drew the line there where they did, because really the terroir does shift from the Nuit side to the Vosne side. And okay, so here's the 3. So this is the other side of town. This is looking right at Nuit Saint-Georges. So you can see the north side of town here, these 4 plots. There's the town itself, and then the south side of town here. And here's Chalios right on the bottom left here, which is where Gros makes his kind of more intense, rich, dark Nuit cuvee. And if you have the 2 of them next to each other, it makes sense why he separates the 2 of them, because they really are different characters. Nuit Saint-Georges, interestingly, has no Grand Crus. It's the only major town in the Côte de Nuit that has no Grand Crus. There's a number of Premier Crus that are well respected, but they're all on the Nuit side down here. So I would say that I think most people consider the fanciest, or at least the most honest expressions of Nuit Saint-Georges, the truest expressions of Nuit Saint-Georges at its top are on this side down here where the Premier Cru Les Saint-Georges is. Here's Michel himself. I should say that I'll just pause for a second and talk about his style. So Gros is part of a very old family in Vosne-Romanée. His mother, excuse me, was the mayor of Vosne-Romanée. They've lived there for 200 or 300 years. They are the town. They're a fixture of the town. As with most of the other winemakers in there, there's at this point there's 4 different Gros that are making wine that are descendants of what was 2 generations ago a single Gros family, and so they split a generation ago into 2, and then this generation, Michel's father split between Michel, his brother Bernard, and his sister, whose name I'm forgetting. I think it's Anne-Françoise Gros. Anyway, and then the other brother, his uncle, is now his first cousin's domain, which is Anne Gros. And so there's Gros all over the place. They all make very good wine, all of them. Michel's style, I would say, is, at least as compared to most winemakers today in Burgundy, on the more interventionist side. So he's very, very careful. He's a very careful winemaker. He's a very careful grape grower. And he has a fair amount of intervention in how his wines are extremely consistent. Every year you can kind of taste them. They taste like Gros, but at the same time, they taste like the terroirs that they are. So I think you'll see here, he's applying the same technique to all 5 of these wines, but really the terroir is showing through. There are some winemakers that, where the house style overpowers the terroir. There are some winemakers where they try to have as little house style as possible, and they let the terroir do all the talking, or the vintage and the terroir do all the talking. Gros style is a little bit more in the middle. So he's really, he wants to have a house consistency and what turns out to be a house style married with an honesty of terroir. So that the terroir should change, but really it should be a consistency of each of these wines should taste like where they come from, but it should also taste like who they come from. So that's kind of his philosophy. Oh, this, I should say, is a picture that is taken on the road between Nuit Saint-Georges and Vosne-Romanée. So this is the border road, just so you can see how much of a large border there is. On the left here are the vines for wine number 2, and on the right here are the vines for wine number 4. So again, they drew these lines centuries, almost 1,000 years ago. Monks did it with no knowledge of geology. They just kind of tasted what it tasted like from here and what it tasted like from here, and they decided that, that's where the border should go. And I think, as you'll see, if you taste 2 next to 4, they got it right. All right, so we're now going to move to wine number 3. We're going to skip over Vin Romanée and over the Clos Vougeot and Échezeaux, which I guess one should never do, but we're just going to do for this point, up to Chambord-Musigny. That's the next town up here after Vin Romanée and Clos Vougeot. Clos Vougeot is, of course, this large ancient Grand Cru with a large ancient chateau right in the middle here. It's a huge vineyard with 82 different owners, of which Michel Gros is the smallest. He has the least number of vines of any of the 82 different owners. And he makes, in 2019, he made 2 barrels of wine, and we got all of 2 cases allocated to us. So that's why we're not pouring this one today. The wine number 3, though, comes from Chambord-Musigny, and most of it comes from this plot right here. About 2/3 of it comes from Les Argilières, which is a village level wine. You can see on this map, village level is in pink, Grand Cru is in this darker red, and then the Premier Cru is in orange right in the middle. Argilière is a village level wine, but it's immediately next to Les Musigny, which is one of the most famous vineyards in all of Burgundy. And Argilière is a particularly well-placed village level plot that produces very bold, very rich wines. Argile is French for clay, so there's a lot of clay in the soil, which typically produces very bold, intense wines. And I think you'll see, even if you look in the glass of these 2 wines next to each other, the Chambord almost looks like Syrah. I mean, it's extremely dark, and it comes through in the glass too. But I mean, just look at it next to a piece of white paper, next to any of the other wines. It's kind of remarkable how much darker and more intense it is. Village level wine, though. And it's a blend of, it's 2/3 Argilière, and then the other third is a blend of Nazoir, and then Maladière and Mombi, which are 3 village level plots down here. Yeah, 3 is much different. I agree with you. I think when I was tasting these, 3 is kind of the outlier. And you can see, it's its own appellation. It's definitely a separate appellation. It's really not that far away from 2, 4, or 5. It makes it look like it on this, but you can see, I mean, these are individual little houses here. So this is probably 1.5 miles or 2 miles between this collection and this collection, but you can see really the terroir does shift quite a bit. In the mouth too, there's just a much more intensity to the wine. Chambord is typically thought of as a silkier and a more refined, more elegant. It's a really nice combination of intensity and structure, but more, but just, kind of ethereal, smoky, mineral silkiness to it too. Much darker, but it strains my biases that the Chambord is bigger and darker than the Nuit. I agree with you. I mean, usually Chambord is going to be much softer and silkier than Nuit Saint-Georges. Nuit Saint-Georges is typically bigger, but here you can see we're biasing it a little bit because the Nuit is up near the Vaune border and the Chambord is in this particular village level plot that's right next to Les Musigny, so it's maybe a village level plus. There's a lovely nose in the Chambord, though, isn't there? Nice notes of kind of toastiness, but nothing. It's just a nice kind of blend of toast and fruit and spice. Yeah, it's a lovely nose. Again, it's very bold in the mouth. Yeah, and you go back and forth with the Nuit and the Chambord. The Nuit has kind of it's certainly less intense. It has somewhat of a brighter nose, actually, or somewhat of maybe a drier nose. There's just less of the perfume and less of kind of the depth and kind of a heady perfume that you get in the Chambord. Chambord seems more serious, like a more serious wine to me today. It's funny. It's not, I wouldn't say it's longer than the Nuit Saint-Georges, but it's just fuller and bolder and deeper. It isn't particularly a longer lasting wine on the palate, maybe a little bit, but the intensity doesn't hold back. I would say as it hits your palate, it's just kind of there all of a sudden. And the Nuit intensity takes a little bit, maybe the same weight, but it just doesn't have the same kind of concentration that the Chambolle has. Chambolle is a very interesting wine, particularly because that's, if you know Chambolle Musigny, that's not the typical expression. I think though that this, I mean, this is benefiting from the year, which is a very, very warm year with a lot of ripeness. I will also say that basically every year this Chambolle is unusually intense for a Chambolle. I don't think of it as this much unusually intense, but in 2019, it was similarly intense in a good way. It's impressive richness, weight, secondness. Yeah, there's something about the weight and the shape of this wine. It's really, really lovely. Okay, so let's move to wine 4. This is a picture of Chambolle. This is in Argilière. You can see how clay rich the soil is. This picture is taken right up here on this road. So looking down into Les Argilières as it turns to Musigny. You can see too, this is interesting because it's almost a north-facing vineyard. This is looking pretty north, and you can see that it gets plenty of sun in the morning, but usually to have a wine that's this kind of, intense and concentrated, you need a lot of sun to ripen it. Again, 2018, there was sun everywhere, but it's interesting, this is drawing most of its intensity from this very clay heavy soil here. Another interesting thing about Chambolle Musigny is it's the only town along here that's not along the RN74. And it's kind of tucked back here. And what's interesting about it is that there's basically nowhere else that they can go to build anything here. I mean, real estate is at a premium in all these places, but Chambolle Musigny is up against this forest. And if you drive this way out of town, you're in this valley. It's lovely, very pretty drive, but you end up, in the hills off to the side here. And it's you're very cramped in Chambolle Musigny. You certainly can't go out into this way because there's priceless vineyards all around you. You can't do anything with the forest because you can't do anything with forest in France. And then you can't go out that way and you can't go this way. So it's a very small town and they can't really expand. So everybody goes up, but you can't go too far up because there's a lot of historical rules. So where most people are going is over here. A couple very famous winemakers, and it actually are one of our producers in Chambolle Musigny. There's a large, I won't call it an industrial park, but it's kind of a winemaker industrial park right over here where people have built these very new, very modern places. So our producer has a very small spot right in the village here. And then they do most of their winemaking on the outside of town here in this place, because it's really the only place you can afford to build anything at all. Okay, so yeah, this is Chambolle. It's a beautiful little town, and probably particularly pretty because you can't expand on it at all. And then if you head up that way, you're in a very old craggly valley. Okay, so we're going to now head back down to number 4 here, which is Vosne Romanée, and this is the village Vosne. So this will be an interesting comparison. We're going to move back to Vosne, and the reason I did this instead of going, Nuit and then Vosne and then Chambolle is so we could do 4 and 5 next to each other as well. So the comparison here will be between 2, 3, and 4 as the 3 village level wines, but then also between 2 and 4 as these really close village level wines, and then 4 and 5 where you're almost in the same exact location. You're within 100 yards of each other for all of these vineyards, but 5 is all from the Clos d'Area, which is this particularly favored Premier Cru. So you'll see the difference between village level and Premier Cru. Before we get there, we're going to start with the village level Auréa, or the village level Vosne Romanée, number 4. That is a blend of 3 different plots: Auréa, Au-dessus de la Rivière, and La Colombière, which is right here in the town. So again, wine 2, if you have some left, is is majority of these 2 plots here. There are 2 other plots over there, but a lot of it comes from right here, right over the border into Nuit Saint-Georges. It's a really nice fineness in this nose, isn't there? there's a kind of a refinement, certainly next to the Chambol. Usually in a lineup, Chambol and Vone will kind of compete for which one's more elegant. I think Vone's going to win this one. And that's not to knock on the Chambol, but the Chambol just has a lot more depth than it often has. It's definitely brighter than the Chambol too. Chambol has an intensity, a kind of a dark seriousness. Nuit is a little bit higher tone, a little bit brighter. Excuse me, I said Nuit, I meant the Vone. And in the mouth, it's very silky, very fine. I would say this is definitely longer than 2 and 3, just in terms of how it persists on the palate. It's very fine, very, very refined, I would say too. There's a classic kind of spice to the wine, a little bit of almost like soy sauce or not quite mint, but maybe pine or something. That's a very pretty nose. So make sure that you go back and forth too between wines 2 and 4, just to see what that line there, how much work this line here is doing between Vone and Chambol and Nuit Saint-Georges. And again, you know, these two plots here are pulling it towards the Chambol end of the spectrum, or the Vone end of the spectrum, and the 2 plots off screen here are pulling it towards the Nuit end of the spectrum. But it's still kind of remarkable that you can get 2 different wines on either side of that border that tastes so different. And really the only thing that's being changed here is terroir. The harvest date is effectively the same, or the harvest week is the same. The vinification is the same. Grapes are about the same age. The vines are about the same age. They're about 40 years old for both of them. Vinification is the same. Bottling is the same. Oak is the same. Really the only major variable that you're changing here is the terroir between the 2 plots. Yeah, there's kind of a quietness of the Vone. It's kind of not as showy, certainly not as showy as the Chambol, but it's very elegant. And the Nuit, I think, is not showing poorly next to them, but it isn't showing the same. It's showing a little bit of a kind of a blunter style than the Vone. It's very interesting. Really silly palate presence. Yeah, I agree. There's a very beautiful length in the Vone, particularly for a village level wine. It's amazing. Boy, and the Chambol really is an outlier. It's very interesting how different they are. They're all, I wouldn't say any of them is missing much. They all are kind of complete in their own way. For me today, the Chambol seems the most intense for sure, but it also seems the youngest to me in terms of kind of approachability of these 3. Maybe it's just the intensity, but it seems like I like it now. I certainly wouldn't turn away a glass of it now, but I think I would love to see it in a number of years. The Vone, I also would like to see in a number of years, but I'm not sure it needs it quite as much as the Chambol does. There's a kind of a softness to the Vone that isn't in the Chambol. And the Nuit, I think, is also, I don't know, has less of both of those things, but they're kind of in the right balance as well. All right, let's do a poll. Everybody likes polls. I think I can do this without changing my screen. We will find out. Okay, so without knowing prices, without knowing if someone else was buying, and you had to pick one of the village wines, 2, 3, or 4. Which one is your favorite? I can't tell if I usually have to stop sharing my screen. Oh no, okay, everyone's voting. Good. All right. We got most of the votes in. We'll give a couple more seconds. It's almost like a cocoa, like a baking chocolate powder, not even remotely sweet, 0% sugar baking chocolate in the foam. That's lovely. Okay, got basically everybody voted, and I'll share the results. Winner is the Vosne, not in a landslide, but a decisive margin, and then next the Chambol. I think I picked the Vosne today if I was going to drink one, if someone else was buying. Great. Okay, so let's move to the Premier Cru, wine number 5. Chambol and Vosne are similar today. Yeah, I see that too. I think they're different in they're a good study in terroir, but a good study in in winemakers. Gros style really does come through. All right, so wine number 5. Wine number 5 is is a special wine for the Gros family. Did I stop sharing this? I'll let you know. I have to stare at this. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, great. So this is the Clos de Rea. The Clos de Rea was purchased in 1860 by the Gros family, back when it was just one family, the whole vineyard. And back in 1860, it wasn't a big deal to own a whole vineyard in Burgundy. Since then, it's become a very big deal. And over the course of those several splits over the last couple of generations that I was telling you about before, in a lot of places, the Clos de Rea was part of, well, in every generation, the Clos de Rea was part of what was being passed down. And so it was a monopole when it started, meaning they owned the whole thing. And I should just say that monopoles are not unusual really anywhere except in Burgundy. In Burgundy, for centuries, the church owned everything, and then it was split up, and then from the Napoleonic Code, the rule was that Napoleon abolished primogeniture, which is where the first son inherited everything, all the inheritance from the father. So when that was no longer allowed, every son was eligible to inherit, their share. Whether there's 3 sons, they each get a third. And so all of these vineyards that started off as single ownership were passed down into sons, and then they intermarried to other places. So you have this wild collection of different vineyards all over Burgundy, most of which are owned by different families. The Clos Vougeot, being the best example, is owned by 82 different owners, and some people will own a row here and a row here and all over the place because they've inherited it. And it's a wild patchwork of different owners. So to have a vineyard where the whole thing is owned by a single person is unusual in Burgundy. And so when they do that, they put monopole on the vineyard on the label, which means monopoly. So the Domaine Michel Gros has a monopole of this whole triangle shaped vineyard right here, the Clos de Rea. It's the only monopole Premier Cru in Vosne-Romanée. Most people think of Vosne-Romanée as the best town for Pinot Noir in the world, particularly in Burgundy. And it's home to Romanée-Conti, which is generally thought of as the best Pinot Noir vineyard in the world, and maybe the best vineyard in the world, La Tâche. Tons of very famous vineyards all over Vosne-Romanée. So to have the only Premier Cru monopole in the town is a big deal. And so Michel Gros, when his father Jean Gros was splitting up the vines between Michel and his brother and sister, Michel elected to forego his portion of Richebourg Grand Cru right here, which is an extremely famous Grand Cru in Vosne-Romanée, which he would have inherited. He gave up his portion of Richebourg so that he wouldn't have to split up the Clos des Réas, and he was able to keep it as a monopole. So it remains a monopole today because Michel Gros gave up his Richebourg portion to keep it as kind of the flagship wine of the Domaine Michel Gros. So it's a very famous vineyard, and it was originally purchased in 1860. The first vintage was 1861, and so under the Gros name. And so this is the 2019 is the 160th. Is that right? 160. Yeah, 160th anniversary of the Gros family owning the domain. And so this year they have recreated the label. We're drinking the 2018. 2019, they've recreated the original label, or one of the original labels that they used when it won gold medal at the World's Fair in Paris. I think I have a picture of the label somewhere on here. In any event, it's a famous, it's very dear to the Gros family's heart. It's been in their family for a very long time. It's fairly large, as you can see by Burgundy standards. It's over 2 hectares. And just in terms of the neighborhood that it's in, I've blown this up here so you can see. Here's Romanée Saint-Vivant, Richebourg, Romany-Conti, La Romanée, Grand Rue, Richebourg over here. I mean, it's just, it's kind of astonishing how well located it is for something that is that big and that has been, you know, in the family for that long. This is a picture of the vineyard itself is right here. This is La Tâche, just for reference. This is the hill up above, and you can kind of see from here, it's a convex shape. So it's a shape of a vineyard that it's a little bit like the curvature of the globe or of the eye. And so it drains particularly well. And it has this very unusual salmon colored marl in the soils, this kind of pink marl that gives it this kind of silkiness, very hard marl that can crumble when it's wet, but the drainage goes right off of it. This is the original label, or this is the 1867 label that won a gold medal. Back when you could put gold medals on your labels in France. But this is really, I mean, this is the original wall. They still have this wall. It's a really cool, very special spot. The vines average about 40 years old. They plant them, Michel plants them usually, you know, kind of here and there to kind of keep the average up. But he just did about 1/5 of it uprooted and replanted it a couple of years ago. So the average has dropped a little bit. After you replant, you can't use it for a couple of years, but they'll be adding to, you know, it'll be back. Those vines will be back in production, and the age will kind of average up, obviously, as we keep going. We were drinking the 2018, right? 15 on the label. No, it's the 18 that we're drinking now. So all these wines are 18. So I'll stop talking about it. And really, the comparison that you should do here is between, I think, is between number 4 and number 5, just to see what village level versus Premier Cru in the same town means. Réa is a wine that ages really nicely, as you would expect most Premier Crus to age, but actually, because of the kind of silky softness, drinks pretty well young too. It's well known for that kind of approachability in its youth. Having had Réa with some age on it, not 30 years of age, but even 10 years of age, it just does magical things when you give it a little bit of time. So it's a little bit of shame to open wine at an early stage, but it isn't unpleasant. I think, as you'll see, at an early age. So between the nose on 4 and 5, I think it's a good lesson in Vone too. You can kind of see the similarities of the nose in 4 and 5 versus 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, even if you just go back to 3, 4 and 5 just have a it's like a bright intensity. It's intensity, it's concentration and depth and kind of density, but not in a heavy way, not in a deep way, in kind of a high toned way that makes it a little easier to. It just makes it approachable. And I think what you get in the mouth is depth and length. Wow, it's still going. Kind of a similar, deepness and fullness that the Chambal had, but with more of it longer. And then also just with the, yes, wow, it's still going. Also with the kind of softness and silkiness that you find in the Vone. That's lovely. Let's say extra elegance hopes for. Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, not revealing everything. I totally get that too. I think the Vone on its own is an easier thing to approach now, just because it's promising less in the future. Yeah, because there's just there's a softness to that isn't in the Village, or in the Premier Cru. But boy, the Premier Cru there's just a lovely balance to it. Yeah. Yeah, it's a little more wound up today than the Vone seems a little bit more unwound in a good way, a little more relaxed. The Premier Cru is just kind of, it has intensity that you would imagine a Premier Cru would have. It's interesting to do it next to the Chambal too. Looking at this picture, the vines look a lot like the orcs attempting to breach Helm's Deep. That's the best comment. I'm sorry to Jeff, who usually has the best comment of the day, but that's definitely the best comment of the day. That's awesome. I don't even know who it is. It says Brookline room 12. I can't even thank you who it is, but thank you whoever wrote that. This actually is a picture that I dug up. This is the Clos des Reas. That's my daughter, Evelyn. And I realized I looked at the date on this photo, and this is 2012. This is the day that 2018. This is the day that they were harvesting the 2018 in Burgundy. So these very grapes that you're looking at here on the vines with my 18-month-old daughter are the vines, or some little piece of them is probably in your glass. Some molecule from these grapes here in this picture, 2018 in the Clos des Reas, are probably in your glass right now. I found that fun. Stefan, oh, good. Okay, good. I will thank you in person. It's I almost wish that I had a Premier Cru from Vone. It wasn't this, so you could see what a young Premier Cru, how much even less than this a young Premier Cru would be giving you right now. There is just something very easy, even in a big year, even at a Premier Cru level, even only a couple years past the harvest. That just makes it a very pleasant wine. Okay, let me grab another poll for you. Okay, so I didn't know how to do this. I was going to say, my original question was going to be, do you prefer the Premier Cru or the Village level of Vone, which didn't seem fair because I think most people would prefer the Premier Cru eventually, or today maybe they prefer the Village level. So I thought the more interesting question, and I'll probably get some flack for this, but in terms of price, just because we haven't done price yet, the Premier Cru is about 75% more pricier than the Village. So the question here, and obviously there's a lot of, you can do a lot of caveats, take this in a lot of directions, but the question is the Premier Cru 50% or 75% better than the Village today? I don't even think I wrote today, because that's another, you could say today or not today. So do with this question what you will. And you can see actually in 2018, looking at this picture, just how insanely ripe these grapes were. Just bursting with juice and blue dark intensity. I don't have a comparison picture, but when I did the harvest in 2013, they did not look like this. And it was in the middle of October, and it was in the middle of a rain, mud storm, and there was mold all over a lot of the grapes that we had to sort out as we were picking them. So 2018 was much much sunnier, much more fun. All right, so I've got, oh, everyone has voted. Awesome. So 75% better. We've got, it's a close race, 9 votes for yes, 6 votes for no. I'm going to put that as a toss up then, because I think, as Jeff points out, 75% it'll be better in the long run, elegance, longevity, complexity, etc. I think that's about right. That's kind of where I come down, and I'm not sure I could pick one over the other. All right, so while we're here, while I have you doing polls, I know I'm just about in under an hour. Favorite wine overall of the tasting, if someone else is buying, if you're at a restaurant and someone else is picking the wine up for you. And then after this, we'll do best value. I'll give you the pricing for all. I also think this label that they, so in 2009, on the 150th anniversary of them owning the Clos de Real, they recreated this label. So if you buy 2009 Clos de Real, that doesn't have the original, doesn't have the normal label. This one here down at the bottom, it has this label that they recreated. It's very cool, and they have 150th anniversary. They're doing that again for 2019. There's this random superstitious thing that happens in Burgundy where all years that end in 9 and kind of all years that end in 5 and 9 are very good years. You have to go back to 100 years before you end up with a year that ends in a 9 that wasn't either like a good year or an extraordinary year. So they just happened to hit this year. They're recreating this label again for the 160th anniversary of the Clos de Real as well. Okay, all votes are in. We've got, I'll show the results. We've got 1 vote for the Chambal, 3 for the Vaughan Village, and 11 for the Clos de Real. I agree with you there, actually. Okay, so now I'll give you the prices for these. I think I have this on here too. Yeah, here we go. So best value given the pricing. So Oak Coat's 34, the Nuit is 69, the Chambal and the Vaughan are 92, and the Clos de Real is 164. And again, these are all 2018s. This one always takes a little longer for people to figure out. But the Nuit is kind of opening up, isn't it? If you have Nuit left in your bottle, I would pour some in a glass, go, for a walk around the block, then come back to it. That's really lovely with some air. All right, a couple more a couple more seconds for everybody to get their votes in. Just about everybody. All right, I'm gonna end the poll here. So the Vaughan Village wins this one by a noticeable margin. We got votes for every wine, which means it's good. I agree. I think the Vaughan Village is drinking beautifully today. Although I do think, if you look at the Oak Coat, I'm not surprised the Oak Coat got some votes. That's an impressive value at the level, and that's the mark of a good winemaker is they make good wines for every level that they're in. Good. Well, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of these wines too. As usual, we're going to do 15% off for the next 24 hours for anybody in this Zoom. And I'll send a follow-up email if you want to order any of these. And actually, we're extending the discount to any of the 2018s from Gros. So Gros makes another Haute Côte cuvee, which we also have a little bit of. And he makes what else is on here? A Morey Saint-Denis, which is the next town up from Chambon-Musigny that we have a little bit of that is on here too. And I think that's priced between the Nuit and the Chambon. But everything 2018 from Gros is on the list. So if any of these strike your fancy and you want to stock your cellar, there'll be a discount for the next day or so. And then coming up, I should just say that tomorrow is the deadline for our October Futures issue. And so October Futures doesn't have any of these wines, but it has all of these wines in 2019, the next vintage up. And so if any of these wines particularly caught your eye, October futures pricing is considerably better than our regular retail pricing because you purchased it in advance. These wines, the 2019s, will probably be in by the end of the year, the calendar year. possibly after that, just because everything gets delayed these days. But if you liked any of these and you're interested in, the minimum order is a half case for each wine, but they're available at a discount. I think I have the discount here. Yeah. So just to give you an idea, the futures pricing for these wines is 29, 54, 74, 74, and 124. So noticeable discounts to what they are in regular. And then elsewhere in the October futures catalog, there's some lovely white Burgundies from Boyer Martineau, which was the last tasting we did. Some reds from Bravo, Goubert, Triboulet, Coulange, Salomon, Undhoff, and Robust and Gros Champagne. So there's lots of things in that. And then also there's 2 more Zoom tastings, which I know a lot of you guys have already signed up for, but we're excited about these other 2. The next one is going to be Roger Bellon, and that's going to be a little different because we're going to do 2 whites and 3 reds. So Bellon happens to be a really good winemaker for both his whites and reds. And we're very excited to try both of those next to each other. We'll see 2 whites that he does, and then we'll do 3 reds from 3 different terroirs as well, 3 different villages actually. And then the last one is going to be a little bit different because we're going to do 6 wines, as if 5 wasn't enough. We're going to do 2 vertical trios, Chambon-Musigny, 1 vineyard, Premier Cru Les Feuilles, which is one of the better Premier Crus in Chambon-Musigny. 3 different vintages of that, and then 3 different vintages of a Châteauneuf du Pape in a Châteauneuf du Pape producer that they're red. We're going to do 18, 17, 16, and then the Chambon is going to be 19, 16, 15. So those will be fun too. Great. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this. This was lots of fun. I think this is a really interesting way to get to know a producer and to get to see the differences of terroirs. Gros, is one of those people who he just can't. He always makes good wine. He always makes wine that's honest to the vintage and honest to the terroir. But it's just he engineers it. He has such control over how the wines come out that they're just consistently excellent every year. And so it's always easy to do Gros tasting. Good. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this. It was good to see a lot of you today at the depot, and we'll see you next month, hopefully. And I hope you have a nice rest of your weekend.